And we are joined now by Yaki Saliers from the Institute of Security Studies to talk a little bit more about the Russia situation. Yaki, a very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. I was actually going through the Telegram channels of the Russian embassy and foreign ministry, and just on that latest news, they've posted a picture of the Russian president in conversation with the Belarusian president Lukashenko, as well as the president of Kazakhstan. So if we could just speculate as to what happened now with this about turn of what was said to be mutinous action by the Wagner group.
Yes, well, so we saw the Wagner group with apparently about 25,000 soldiers that took over control of Rostov-on-Don, which is the southernmost Russian city, about 1 million people, which is the effective command center for the Russian forces in their attack and aggression on Ukraine. And they took that without any opposition, without a shot being fired, apparently, which is really quite remarkable. And then they started advancing on the road that apparently is known as the M4 on their way to Moscow. And they were well on their way, more than halfway on their way to Moscow, had passed the city of Voronezh. And then apparently on the facilitation of President Alexander Lukashenko of Belarus, turned around. And this is a hugely significant development. I think there was a point a few hours ago only when we were thinking that they would be reaching the outskirts of Moscow by tonight, and that maybe by tomorrow we would have seen effectively what would have been a coup d'etat in Mozambique, in Russia. So very, very interesting developments.
And what President Putin has said, including the Russian Foreign Ministry, saying that they are warning the West against what they see as Russophobic actions, but also speaking about a betrayal with regards to what the Wagner group has said. But they seem to point a picture of infighting within the Wagner group, as though that there were divisions. What are your thoughts about this, and what would have led to this?
No, it's not infighting within the Wagner group, it's infighting within the Russian security establishment. So you have a unit which is effectively paid for and managed Wagner by the Russian military, which had been fighting in Ukraine on behalf of Russia as part of the invasion in Ukraine, that basically staged an effort at an insurrection. They withdrew from the battlefield after Putin had said this grouping needs to be integrated into the Russian military. Now, it's important to understand that Wagner was created by the Russian military, by Putin in particular. So you have real infighting and destabilization within the Russian armed forces, and who knows what the outcome of this could be. So when Wagner then said, we are not going to be integrated into the Russian military, and we are sick and tired of the way in which particularly the Russian defense minister and chief of staff have been managing the war in Ukraine, they started then basically advancing on Moscow as hugely significant developments.
Okay, so when you talk about an internal betrayal, so it's about Russian troops and the Wagner group, that's what you're saying, and not necessarily comrades within the Wagner group turning against those inside?
No, not at all. No, not at all. Wagner is for all effective purposes, part of the Russian security establishment. They are sort of established at arm's length, so that it provides Putin with the ability to fight outside and to engage in Africa, for example, where they've been involved in Syria, Libya, Central African Republic, Mali, Sudan, Chad, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, just to give you a list of the areas where they've been engaged in. And eventually they, in a sense, became too powerful, and that's when Putin gave the order that they should be integrated into the standard Russian military. And then Prigozhin refused, the head of Wagner, and then started with this advance on Moscow.
And in fact, there is speculation at the moment about what has happened, what led to the about turn. Some are saying that it's possible that President Putin has reached a deal with Prigozhin after the Russian Defense Ministry has said to planning to dismantle the Wagner military force. But what are your thoughts about this? Could there be a criminal case against Prigozhin, seeing that President Putin himself has labeled him a traitor in his earlier address?
Well, you have two war criminals fighting one another, Putin and Prigozhin. I mean, they have both been considered that for some time. I think what has happened now is that the situation, of course, is complicated. We don't know exactly what has happened, but I think two scenarios can emerge from this. On the one side, if we think back at what happened when, I think it was 2016, when there was an attempted coup d'etat in Turkey, Erdogan came back very hard and really re-established his grip in a very authoritarian manner on Turkey. It's possible that Putin can do the same, but what is very important is that this, of course, weakens the Russian position in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are poised to launch their counteroffensive, and the Russians probably are quite demotivated and probably disorganized as a result of this. So this provides an opportunity for the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and then who knows what could happen. There is, I think, now the real possibility that if the Ukrainians make a breakthrough, that you could see quite a collapse of the Russian military and the chances then of a defeat. So that's a real defeat of the Russian military. That could happen, but who knows how this is going to pan out.
So some of those who are trying to explain how this offensive occurred was that Prigozhin and his forces were moving so swiftly that it caught the Russian military off guard and allowed for Ukraine to liberate several positions in Donetsk, as Ukraine is reporting now. Do the Russians have a real reason to say that there may be a Western agenda behind what has happened? Because, as you say, the Wagner group has been funded and is allied to the Russian military. Could there be funding coming from elsewhere to change allegiance?
No. I think that is really widely speculative. What seems to be much more possible is that there's some type of agreement between Wagner and members with the FSB, the former KGB of the Russian, that there's some type of internal engagement within the Russian military, of those sections of the Russian military that are really disaffected by the way and the very obvious incompetence through which Russia has waged this war. This isn't, remember, Russia invaded Ukraine, and this war could end tomorrow if Russia ceases and withdraws from Ukraine. It's nobody else is at fault here. So the West is, of course, sitting back, but we could end up with a real bad security chaos in Russia if this had gone its full circle. If eventually the Wagner group had reached Moscow and you saw fighting in Moscow, this could have been really quite bad, that situation. But what is without a doubt is that the Ukrainians are going to seize this opportunity to launch their counterattack and try and see if they can remove the Russians from their territory.
All right, so the march back was characterized as preventing the spilling of Russian blood. We've had Prigozhin, who said that he has taken control of the Russian military base in Rostov, and that this really was to confront his enemies. We've mentioned the defense minister, including the army general, chief of general staff of the Russian armed forces. Does that mean that then the chessboard game goes back to Rostov, and what unfolds next is premeditated, or who has control over that?
Yes, this situation now becomes very, very difficult, particularly for the Wagner group, for Prigozhin, because he has really shown that he has the ability to rock the entire Russian establishment, and it's shown the weakness of the Russian military as well as the discord within the Russian security agencies, and has clearly weakened the efforts. Now, he's in control of Rostov-on-Don, which is the command and control center for the entire Russian front into Ukraine. And this is going to have quite a destabilizing effect, I think, on the Russian. Although, of course, Prigozhin and Wagner are committed to the war on Ukraine, to the aggression on Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine. But I think it's going to have quite a devastating effect on the rest of the Russian armed forces, which, of course, is the majority of the armed forces that are engaged on their invasion of Ukraine.
Oh, thank you so much for speaking to us. Of course, there have been travel restrictions within Russia, including other countries nearby. Germany, France also putting out alerts to their citizens to avoid traveling. Yaki Cilliers is with Institute of Security Studies, just speaking to us about the events in Russia, between Russia and the border with Ukraine, as the Wagner group earlier on marched on Russia in a bid to unseat Vladimir Putin, we hear. And of course, there's been a turnaround in that situation. We'll keep monitoring those events in international news.